To my dearest friends, I am honored to once again welcome you to today's sermon. If we were to sit and ponder on the current state of the Imperium as it so stands within this tumultuous time of ending, it would be truly challenging for any of us to claim that this is an era of peace and safety. Our ancient ancestors always dreamed of a time where humanity could seize dominion over the very stars themselves. And yet, they could never have imagined the sheer scale of horror to be found out in that endless void. Despite their best efforts, the various sentient species of the galaxy find themselves to be locked in an eternal war, from which no side can gain a consistent upper hand. And this ceaseless conflict has turned the Milky Way into a veritable graveyard. The only life to be found here will be from the hardy few who have managed to overcome the odds and carve out an existence for themselves amidst the great bones of the fallen empires. But with the blaring light of the Astronomicon now illuminating this ocean of decaying bodies, we could almost see the galaxy as having become something of a tempting, ever so enticing lure. As horrifying as it is to admit, there do indeed exist alien creatures which prowl within the abyssal depths of intergalactic space. But from what we understand, they have all been devoured, leaving only one nightmarish hive, and these would be known as the Tyranids. The Extragalactic Predators have been drawn towards us, and as it so stands today, the invasion of these unending swarms is well underway, to the point where it may indeed seem that our galaxy is destined to die in the foul underbelly of a Tyranid bioship. We are all aware of the concept of hive fleets, and thus far we have encountered several dozen of the splinters, each being rather distinct from one another. Thankfully, we have been successful in defeating some of these foul strains, and yet the hive mind is nothing if not resourceful, and it will not be content to simply watch its offspring die amidst the silent void. Even the grisly remains of a biofleet will contain an incomprehensible bounty of biomass, battlefield experience, and information on the threats which they encountered. And these are things which are far too valuable to ignore. In response to the failures of their predecessors, we will now encounter the curious cannibalistic hive fleet, designated as Hydra, and they will be our topic for today. In brief, the Tyranids of Hydra will follow in the wake of failed hive fleets, subsuming and devouring any remaining biomass which can be recovered from their vestigial dregs. Any memories of their defeat will be absorbed, and the hive mind will then use this to calculate new methods or tactics necessary to overcome the foes who brought their cousin fleet low. As it now stands, Hydra has spread out across the galactic rim, where it simply lurks and waits in the dark. But as soon as it senses the tantalizing scent of hot Tyranid blood, then they will emerge, eager to ravenously feed upon the delectable remains of their own species. But with this, it is now time for us to begin. I will first give a more in-depth overview as to the hive fleet of Hydra, going over some of their tactics, movements, and of their current state within the galaxy. After this, I will showcase some of the more notable of engagements which we have learned of before finally speculating on their future and of the role they may play in a galaxy which has been fully consumed by the Tyranid menace. Without further ado, however, we must turn our attention to the cosmic graveyards of the Tyranids, for within those desolate regions we can be sure to find the skulking, prowling forces of Hive Fleet, Hydra. To understand the purpose of Hive Fleet Hydra, we must first hold a firm grasp on the idea of hive fleets in general. In short, the Tyranids are a unified species with the untold trillions of individual organisms being connected to one another through the Gestalt consciousness known as the Hive mind. During their approach into our galaxy, they have been broadly split into distinct Hive fleets, each of which will display their own unique coloration, invasion tactics, and biological traits, seemingly as a way to discover the most effective method for consuming the ripe ocean of biomass at their proverbial fingertips. Some of these fleets have been quite simple in their approach, such as with Behemoth, which crashed into the southeastern fringe of Segmentum Ultima as a single charging wedge, in the hopes that brute force would be able to overwhelm any who found themselves on their feeding path. This unstoppable tide, however, finally broke when it reached the unbreakable wall of Ultramar, and it was from the sacrifice of the sons of Guilliman who put a resounding halt to Behemoth. Sensing their failure, the next Hive fleet to appear was named as Kraken, and during their invasion they spread out across a vast region of space in the hopes that a more dispersed approach would allow them to circumvent otherwise impenetrable fortress worlds. Just as with Behemoth, however, Kraken was brought low, with the primary fleet being shattered, from which dozens of smaller, uncoordinated and ineffective splinter fleets have emerged. We could speak endlessly on stories such as these, but so far they tend to have the same ending, where the Hive fleet is defeated, leaving a few pathetic dregs of life behind, who will be too meek to possibly pose a threat comparable to the one held by their parental force. But it is here that we will encounter the Hydra. The lurking horrors of this Hive fleet seem to have gained a cannibalistic taste for Tyranid flesh, and so they will follow along the cold war path of any failed tendrils, only to feast upon whatever remains can be found in the void. They are a shockingly bloated hive, harboring great reservoirs of biomass which would rival that of tendrils far larger than themselves. But this is all thanks to their highly efficient scavenging tactics, which we will soon discuss in more detail. From what we understand, the fleet of Hydra will lay dormant, slightly outside of the galactic rim, but once they sense the death throes of a larger fleet, then they will be roused from slumber, arising as starved beasts, whose hunger could only be sated by the biomass of the Tyranids. At this point, they will follow the ancient psychic traces of their fellow fleet through the void, sailing past worlds which have been left utterly barren by the prior invasion. But even here, in these desolate regions, it is not unheard of for life to bloom. Against all odds, hardy, mutated plant life may indeed have found purchase within the empty wastes of a formerly consumed world. However, they were never destined to survive. Hydra will descend once more upon these devastated graveyards, only to consume any biomass which had been left untapped by the antecedent invaders. We could speculate that the first Tyranids to approach may have been forced to move on rather quickly due to the retaliatory or defensive actions of the species who once lived there, meaning that they were not able to entirely drain a world of its resources. Hydra, however, will have far more time to probe and sniff out the final traces of biomass left amidst the ashes. Given their knowledge on the species, the Imperium will write off worlds and star sectors previously devoured by the Tyranids as being made utterly uninhabitable, to the point where they will not attempt to resettle and rebuild their prior holdings. Thanks to this, and also because none would suspect a second Hive fleet to follow in the same route as another, the bioships of Hydra will be almost entirely unopposed during their scavenging, once again meaning that they may consume every final dreg of life which once existed on the world's surface. As an extension of this, because of the sheer quantity of biomass which Hydra is known to possess, we could further speculate that they may be more effective at exploiting the biological resources of a world than of the other Hive fleets. The bioships of Hydra are so bloated that perhaps they have developed ways of locating underground reservoirs of biomass, or that they may be able to absorb and subsume biological matter in a more efficient way, being able to retain more of its nutrition than otherwise thought possible. This, however, is mere speculation, and we may in fact have a more concrete answer as to why the fleet is so bloated. Moving through the abandoned regions of space previously targeted by the Tyranids, it will be inevitable for us to discover great floating graveyards in which the charred corpses of bioships will endlessly drift, coinhabited only by the scattered remains of conventional void craft and of the lonesome ghosts of their lost crews. These regions would have once been the site of a monumental battle, fought between the unrelenting defenders of a world and of the unending hordes of the Tyranids. But that engagement is but a distant memory, and in its place we will not find a solemn memorial, but instead the Hydra will come to feast. Those blasted remains of the bioships, in which we will find not a stir of sentience, will be utterly devoured by the scavenging beasts who now surround them. Great proboscis-like appendages will stab outwards, penetrating the rotten underbelly of each and every Tyranid biovessel before pumping out streams of potent acids, digestive enzymes, and hyper-adaptive microorganisms, all of which will reduce the ship's interior down into a sludgy pulp of nutritious material. The tough, chitinous shells will flake away, crashing into the newly formed pool as though a colossal iceberg was breaking apart. Fleshy chambers, which previously held the spawning pools and birthing pods of the unending swarms, would rapidly dissolve, with their molecular bonds being cleaved apart until not a single identifiable structure remains. Even the dense skeletal frames which once supported the immense bulk of their biocrafts would be invaded and gnawed away from the microorganisms, burrowing through them like a termite through wood. In the end, there would be nothing left of the ship, nothing left but a globular mass of nutrition, with not a single trace of biomass being left unclaimed. At this point, the digestive appendages would retract and the feeding tubes will emerge. This sprawling mass of capillaries exist only to consume, and they will suck up every last drop of biomass from the vessel, drawing it into the bloated storage organs of the scavenging ship. Furthermore, the remains of whichever alien faction found themselves opposed to the Tyranids will similarly be probed, until even the smallest splatter of blood has been dissolved and subsumed by the Hive. This will continue until the stellar graveyard has been left utterly sterile, and only once the Hydra has sated its appetite will it move on, eager to find a new field to digest and consume. It is important to note here that during this process, the Hydra will not only build up its vast stores of biomass, but that it will also learn of the many secrets once held within the minds of its victims. The Hive fleets are ever an adaptive and reactive force, and they will retain the great many memories and experiences of its prior conflicts, including of how they were brought low during their final days. This knowledge is utterly invaluable, and the Hydra will absorb whatever information it can find, all so that it can hone its own strategies towards the inevitable conflicts to come. In this way, the failures of its predecessors will be used to adapt the writhing swarms of the Hydra in such a way where they will be able to easily counter the enemies who they will be sure to soon meet. For example, if it turned out that the prior Hive fleet was defeated due to having a weakness towards flame-based weapons, then the Hydra will evolve the tissues of its own lesser bioforms to be more resistant towards fire, essentially reducing the effectiveness of their enemies should they soon come to blows. Similarly, if the actual tactics of the fallen Hive were insufficient, then the Hydra will formulate new battle plans and strategies to circumvent their past failings. If the older tendril was only effective due to producing a small number of highly specialized bioforms, which were then overwhelmed by their foe, then the Hydra will plan out for an engagement where they find strength in numbers. Endless swarms of gaunts will be gestated to overrun the defenders, who will not possibly be able to find victory in a conflict where they are outnumbered by a factor of 1,000. Thus, Hive Fleet Hydra will have absorbed not only the biomass of the fallen, but also their tactics, all so that they may respond as an adapted, improved swarm, being ready to counter every strength and strategy of the enemies who once brought them low. Many of you at this point will likely be asking yourself as to whether or not the Tyranids of Hive Fleet Hydra ever encounter the living remnants of the defeated tendril, and whilst we do not possess accurate records of such interactions, it is rather likely that the two hives will, in fact, intersect. Some xenologists have theorized and speculated on the potential for there to be a minor civil war between the two Hive fleets, with the predatory ships of Hydra latching on to feast upon the weakened remnants of their prey. In truth, however, I believe that the shattered Hive actually acts in a far more subservient nature towards the Hydra. Sensing their own failure, the fallen Hive may understand that they cannot continue in their warpath, and in fact they may see the ships of the Hydra as being akin to their salvation. They will readily approach the new fleet, offering up their own biomass to be consumed, thereby providing their final vestiges of life so that the stronger Tyranids may prosper. Of course, this is a point in which we have a fairly limited understanding of, and in fact, I would not be surprised to learn of a scenario in which a defeated Hive attempts to fight for its life against the starved beasts of the Hydra. In a galaxy as large as ours, and with a foe as vast as the Tyranids, truly anything may be possible. But in these cases, it is far more likely for the Hydra to emerge victorious. It will move on, ever more bloated, and prepared for its future endeavors as it soon approaches the bastions which foolishly thought that they were safe against the alien menace. At this point, with the fleets of the Hydra now brimming with biomass, and with the collective, adapted knowledge of their fallen kin taken to heart, they will be poised to resume the prior invasion of the fallen Hive fleet. Only this time, they will be fully prepared to counter whatever strategies that may be brought against them. Every world will have been scoured, every stellar graveyard devoured, and they will now find themselves in a position where cannibalistic scavenging no longer interests them, instead preferring the idea of consuming new, pristine worlds previously untouched by the taint of the Tyranid threat. As soon as they discover the battered star systems of the prior invasion, then a great stimulating surge will flow through the bio-fleet, forcing the slumbering Norn queens to stir back into wakefulness. And here the endless swarm will begin to take form. These horrifying beasts will draw from the bloated stores of biomass found throughout the ship, and from this nutritional flow, the creature will rapidly begin to gestate, before birthing forth the many juvenile bioforms who are destined to make planetfall. The larval offspring are thought to be stored within incubation chambers, where they will be fed from the same stores of biomass, until they quickly reach maturation as a fully formed Tyranid. This process will continue until the bioships of the Hydra are swarming with tiny, wriggling sacs, each containing a ferocious extragalactic alien who only seeks to kill and eat. As I previously stated, thanks to the truly mind-bogglingly large stores of biomass found within their ships, the mass formation and growth of lesser bioforms can seemingly be maintained for a duration which far outlasts that of other Hive fleets. The Hydra does not have to be conservative to any degree when it comes to the creation of new Tyranids, and as such, the swarms it can send down onto a planet will be truly immense. Any losses which the hive mind sustains will be rapidly replaced, to such a degree that perhaps more so than any other fleet, that we may consider the Tyranids of Hive Fleet Hydra to be the true incarnation of an unending swarm. They personify the typical image of the Tyranids acting as a ceaseless, writhing ocean of chittering aliens, greatly contrasting them with some of the smaller, more specialized of fleets which currently exist within the galaxy. Hive Fleet Kronos, for instance, which typically targets demonic worlds or areas of space marred by the touch of the warp, would never be able to build up the stores of biomass which are found in the Hydra, meaning that their tactics tend to be more based around the utilization of highly specialized, warp-sensitive bioforms. Similarly, Hive Fleet Tiamat, which has only recently emerged from its dormant state, has such a limited store of resources that it has resorted to using far smaller but more heavily armored bioforms, as they simply would not be able to produce a swarm of the same size as the Hydra. Thus, our scavenging hive fleet finds itself in a most fortuitous position. Not only can it afford to produce truly endless swarms of Tyranid creatures, but it has also absorbed the secrets of its fallen predecessors, allowing it to more effectively direct its own gnashing tide, to circumvent their species' prior failures. Worlds which once stood as stalwart defenders against the Tyranids will soon find their tactics being completely ineffective against the newly revived menace. If great, unbreakable walls once stood as the deciding factor behind their preservation, then the Hydra will ordain for its gaunts to burrow beneath them, moving through the labyrinthine, underground networks of tunnels previously dug out by packs of Ravenors and Trigons. If a world was able to defend itself simply due to holding a large enough army, then this will similarly prove itself to be foolish when faced against the tides of the Hydra. The Hive fleet will be able to pour a truly limitless stream of bioforms down onto the planet's surface. And so long as the defenders cannot reliably find reinforcements for themselves, then they will surely die amidst the coming tide. There will never be enough ammo to fire into a planet-spanning horde, never enough tanks to shore up their defenses, and never enough bodies to clog up the inevitable holes eaten away by the starved Hive. Prior to the actual invasion, the forces of Hive Fleet Hydra are known to enact a rather sinister maneuver, and it is one which they have only been graced to perform thanks to their endless wellspring of scavenged biomass. Once the fleet reaches close proximity to their prey planet, as far as we understand, they will still initiate the same infiltrative operations, which involve gene stealers and lictors. However, their successes are in no way pivotal to the rest of their plan. For you see, the Hydra can almost be seen as boastful of its resources, and the Hive will not be shy about flaunting their position of biological wealth. To the citizens who live upon the doomed world, the distant light of their local star will begin to grow dim, almost as if a mysterious shroud had enveloped them from the rest of their solar system. What is happening here is that the Hive fleet of Hydra will have seeded the upper atmosphere of the world with a veritable blanket of mycetic spores, each of which contains a dormant clutch of the writhing, chittering Tyranids. They have been suspended here to simply wait, as they are, in fact, merely the supportive backup of the larger invasion which is soon to come. Hovering like putrid parasitic jellyfish, the gaunts within may find themselves to be quickly reabsorbed by the hive mind, having never been deployed to the planet at all. But should they be called upon, then their tides will be truly endless. With this wave hibernating high above, the actual invasion of the world may begin, though indeed the Tyranids of Hydra will appear to be rather inexperienced, having spent much of their existence simply scavenging on the dead. But as we all know, this is merely a facade. They have learned of the enemy's secrets and of the failings of their predecessors, meaning that their own invasive forces are akin to well-honed veterans who may be directed as a single overwhelming force. The bloated hordes will crash down in biological transport ships, pocking the landscape with fleshy craters, within which the first of the acidic digestion pools will spawn, rapidly breaking down the splayed remnants of the dead into their constituent biomass. From these disgusting wounds will the Tyranids stream out from, charging directly towards the weakest locations that could be discovered by the intrusive hive mind. The weapons of the defenders, previously thought of as being more than effective in curtailing the alien terrors, will now appear useless, as the Hydra will have adapted its bioforms to counter the various armaments and techniques brought against its kin. Laser beams will be deflected off of the thick, gleaming plates of chitin. Bolt rounds will explode, having done little but leave an ashen mark upon their flesh. Psychers even will find their powers useless as they are muffled and tortured by the oppressive shroud of the Hydra's shadow. Defensive structures will be broken down, and any within will be devoured, for there can be nothing to stop the relentless approach of these starved beasts. Even if the tides do in fact turn to favor the defenders, it can never be a state which will last for long. For you see, the highly adaptive nature of this hive fleet means that it will be able to sense the newfound strengths of its foes, at which point it will rapidly begin to reform and reshape the bioforms still in orbit, forcing them to mutate in such a way that will counter the emergent threat. And it will be here that the orbiting spores finally reawaken and plunge downwards. The newly evolved Tyranids will burst outwards to replace those who had fallen, only this time they will not be so susceptible to the armaments of the defenders. This process is one which is seemingly endless. The fleet of the Hydra is so vast that it may continuously signal for new spores to adapt and drop into battle at a rate which no other species in the galaxy could possibly match. Thus, to stand upon a world as a soldier, tasked with beheading the great Hydra, would mean that you are facing off with a truly unending foe. Each gaunt killed will simply be replaced by an entirely new clutch, impervious to the weapons you previously used, and as such, your certain doom will rapidly be approaching, carried in the maws of a ravenous Tyranid. Understanding the horrors of the Hive fleet named as Hydra is one thing, but rather sadly, they are no mere myth, and they have proven themselves to be a true blight on the regions of the galaxy, which once thought of themselves as safe from the horrors of the Tyranids. There have been innumerable cases of civilized worlds which had previously repelled the forces of a separate Hive fleet, suddenly finding themselves opposed to a reinvigorated alien wave, and in these situations we can be sure that it was the Hydra to blame. With that in mind, I will now tell of some of the more notable of engagements which we have thus far recorded, in the hopes that it illustrates the terrible potential held by this fleet. The first will relate to the seemingly premature awakening of this most foul scourge. We are not exactly sure as to where, nor when this event occurred, but due to the Hydra's rather insidious habit of lurking within the shadows of the void, we may speculate that the following conflict may have taken place just on the southern galactic rim, likely in the desolated regions where Hive Fleet Leviathan had previously decimated. It was here that the great many bioships of the Hydra simply drifted through the darkness of the cosmos in silent hibernation. They were yet to exercise their cannibalistic habits of scavenging, instead being suspended in peaceful slumber, awaiting the great death cry of a larger Hive fleet, which would spur them into activity and trigger their ravenous feeding frenzy. But their rest amidst the void was to be cut short. A raiding fleet of the nefarious Drukhari had been sailing through this sector, eagerly picking at the bones of the worlds which had fallen victim to the Tyranids of Leviathan, stealing away a great bounty of terrified survivors and treasured loot for themselves in the process. The fallen Eldar belonged to the cabal of the Poisoned Fang, which has thus far evaded most official records, but we do know that they employ a rather impressive number of homunculi, who are presumably tasked with cooking up new, deadly toxins within their fetid laboratories. Knowing of the skills of their kin, the void-bound Drukhari, in their arrogant style, believed that they would be able to board these slumbering Hive ships, where they would steal away a bounty of smaller creatures, biosamples, and any other valuables which appeared to have become lost within the feeding chambers of this ship. In their minds, they believed that the homunculus covens would be able to formulate some truly pernicious venoms from their biotrophies, and yet not a single one of the Drukhari fleet would ever again step foot within the Dark City. As the raiding party stalked through the sickening, pulsating halls of the bioship, an unnatural sense of dread began to wash over them. The slow, squelching hum of the sleeping craft, though quiet at first, rapidly began to elevate in volume, shifting into a reverberating warble before breaking out into a deafeningly ominous dirge. The Tyranid ship, it seemed, had finally awoken. The oozing, weeping walls burst open, and from their wounds, writhing clutches of lesser bioforms scrambled out, heaping over the invaders in a great pile, intent only to utterly devour the foolish pirates where they stood. None could flee, as there was simply nowhere to run. And within the confines of a bioship, there is nowhere to hide. The immense, fleshy chambers and halls flexed, tightening themselves to entrap small groups of the fleeing Drukhari, who were quickly eclipsed under the weight of ripper swarms, burrowing in through their armor to feast upon their delectable interior. Some tried to fight with Dracons and true-born Sybarites screaming orders at their subservience in the hopes that carelessly sacrificing their underlings would provide them with enough time to escape back to their own fleet. But this was not to be the case. Every single Drukhari who had stepped foot within the bioships of the Hydra were consumed within the first hour of its awakening. The remaining pirate fleets, still stationed close by, were not slow to detect the sudden behavioral shift in their target. Garbled screams were heard over the ancient twisted vox apparatus found in their command stations, prompting the corsairs to simply turn face and flee back into the safety of the webway. But there was no time for such a maneuver. The bioship had already emitted a silent awakening signal to the rest of the fleet, and now the entirety of the Hydra had emerged from slumber with a ravenous hunger for any form of biomass it could catch. Not a single Drukhari craft was permitted to flee, and instead they were entrapped and digested within the acidic feeding chambers of the Tyranid vessels. This small fleet of pirates was merely an appetizer, and the hunger of the Hydra was one which required a far greater feast to sate. As such, from this point on, the Hive fleet has moved deeper and deeper into our galaxy, tracing the barren remains of fallen hives, only to devour every trace of life which can be found amidst the ashes. Many years after their awakening, the threat of Hive fleet Hydra was still somewhat unknown to the wider galaxy, and yet they would soon be revealed to all as a true scourge, a scavenging beast which preys upon the weakest of victims, striking only when their foolish targets are at their most vulnerable. For instance, we must only look towards the world of Ollfyre, found within the Coriolanus system, to learn of the true nature of the Hydra. Upon this world we would find jubilation. It had been chosen by the Lord General known as Sivar Dias to host a grand triumph, celebrating the recent efforts of his guardsmen over an extragalactic foe. For you see, over the last several months, he and his forces had been successful in utterly destroying a minor tendril of Hive fleet Leviathan, preventing the swarms from being able to consume the densely populated worlds found in this local star system. It had been a hard-fought victory, with millions dying during the arduous campaign, but their noble sacrifices were given to safeguard the many souls of mankind, and they will ever be remembered as the martyrs who gave everything to halt this ravenous threat. But this celebration was not simply to remember the fallen, as the local lords saw this as an opportunity to prove that the Tyranids were simple creatures, and that if they can bleed, then we can kill them. Taking up some of the larger dregs of the bioforms which had been killed, the Imperial workers affixed them onto great flotillas, so that all may bear witness to the vile remains of those alien horrors. Unfortunately, however, this macabre display would soon prove itself to cause the downfall of Ollfyre and of the entire Coriolanus system. The day of the triumph came quicker than expected. The surviving members of the deployed regiments, now veterans themselves, marched through the dense streets to where a seemingly endless crowd of Imperial citizens had amassed to watch. The cheers were almost overwhelming, and they only rose in volume once the encased corpses of the Tyranids were brought forth. At the head of the procession was the Lord General Sivar Dias. He had resigned himself to fulfill these duties, knowing that at the end of the long march there would be a banquet where he may rightfully feast upon roasted meats and exotic fruits before reclining back as a true hero to the Imperium. Unfortunately, however, just as his part of the triumph reached the marble plaza of fallen heroes, an ominous shadow had become cast over his forces. This was meant to be a cloudless day, but as he craned his neck to spy the obstruction, his heart skipped a beat. The skies were occluded by a falling storm of spores, behind which the dreaded shapes of Tyranid bioships could be seen, floating above like a predator waiting to feast. As each spore crashed down, they burst open, as though rotten fruit falling from a tree, and from within, the skittering swarms of bioforms clawed their way out, falling into the crowds to eviscerate any who they could catch. The masses of guardsmen, still holding their weapons, turned to engage the dreaded aliens, but it seemed that their armaments were far less effective against this new, mutated wave. Their las shots simply left dull fizzing marks upon the strangely thick chitinous shells, barely being registered by the beasts as anything but a slight annoyance. The tactics which they had developed during the prior campaign were similarly ineffective, and as such, the ceaseless tides were able to overrun the entirety of the parade in but a short few hours. As the Lord General himself was torn apart by a swarm of gaunts, his final sight was of the great remains of the Tyranid creatures put on display, which were now infested with small rippers, chewing through the grisly remains as though it was the last meal that they may ever find. The remainder of the world quickly fell in much of the same way as of the parade goers, with the endless swarms of Hive Fleet Hydra sweeping across the planet, culling any resistance before the process of consuming the entire world began. Imperial xenologists, having reviewed the terrible course of events, now suspect that it may have been the use of Tyranid corpses during their celebration which attracted the new tendril of the Devourer. They speculate that the deathly psychic trail, emitted as something akin to a pheromone, was detected as a signal by the Hydra, which then moved in, expecting to simply find a graveyard of Tyranids to consume. Clearly, they found a far greater feast, and from their approach, the entirety of the Coriolanus sector has been declared as dead, with every trace of biomass having been scoured and subsumed by the starved beasts of the Hydra. The next notable engagement occurred around the Imperial agri-world, known as Methuselax, which was greatly suffering from the invasion of a large tendril from Hive Fleet Hydra. We do not know of exactly when this began, nor of why the world was targeted, but this matters not, as the great swarms were already well underway in their process of consuming all life that they could find. The planet had previously been home to immense continent-spanning crop fields, sided by docile herds of animals numbering in the billions. Unsurprisingly, this would be seen as a feast beyond compare to the Tyranids. Living tsunamis of rippers flowed outwards across the world, sweeping through the salubrious landscapes, devouring everything and anything they could. So vast were their numbers that it was rumored that you would be able to see their relentless advance from orbit, as though they were a wildfire, reducing what was once vibrant green down into putrid greys. This world, though undoubtedly imperial in its rule, harboured a secret within its southern pole. An ancient webway gate hidden away by arcane runes of shrouding was often utilized by the Eldari species as a simple nexus point, where they would emerge from the labyrinthine tangle before silently slipping into the void, completely unbeknownst to the imperial populace. Clearly, however, this gate was in grave danger of being destroyed by the relentless approach of the Tyranids. As such, a group of Harlequin masks, originating from the troop of the Soaring Spite, formed a short-lived coalition between their own order, a group of Simhan jet bikers, and of a party of witch cultists from Comora. This ragtag alliance were far too small to face the Tyranid masses head-on, but from the leadership of the ancient Harlequins, they believed that they may be able to protect the southern pole, and thereby the Webway Gate from its inevitable doom. Once they had assembled, time was certainly of the essence. The waves of gnashing bioforms were so vast that it was not safe to even walk upon the world's surface. And so they were forced to enact their operations from the safety of the air, gliding down atop the Simhan skimmers to launch precise covert strikes against their targets. They had quickly identified the largest of synaptic creatures as being vulnerable to predation, and with their deaths, the lesser masses of bioforms quickly fell into disarray, as they no longer held a firm connection with the Hive mind. From this attack, large portions of the encroaching swarm simply ceased in their advance, with the Gaunts and Rippers running as feral, uncoordinated beasts. The Tyranids were quick to respond to the Eldari threats, however, unleashing waves of flying creatures, supported by bloated fields of floating biomines. This proved to be of little danger to the ancient children of the stars. Huge arcs of blood were carved through the air as the nimble harlequins effortlessly pirouetted and leapt from jetbike to jetbike, cleaving swathes of the flying horrors asunder with their humming zephyrglaives. The hulking, bloated creatures below them, arduously marching across the landscape, would periodically open up to unleash a new clutch of lesser bioforms from within. And these brood mothers were similarly seen as key targets to the allied Eldari. Dropping down onto their immense backs, the harlequins were seen to leave a litter of plasma mines, and only once they were picked back up into the safety of the air would they trigger the detonation, reducing the bloated creatures into a hump of wriggling gristle. The Eldari offensive was not entirely without cost. The great ocean of Rippers could almost be seen as a single sentient superorganism, and this chittering tide would routinely undulate and surge upwards as a living column stretching out to the skies above. Though skilled, the Siam Han pilots could not evade every wave, and so an unfortunate few were plucked from the skies to be devoured under the endless tides below them. Similarly, the sheer volume of the airborne gargoyles was simply too much to handle. They seemed to form themselves into vast, flocking murmurations, ensnaring the Eldari vessels before crashing downwards into the starved horde. Despite their losses, as the battle raged on, the tides of war seemed to shift in favor of the Eldari alliance. They were successful in halting the Tyranid advance through to the South Pole, and it appeared that the hive mind similarly realized that this was not to be a fruitful endeavor. There was very little biomass to be found in that frigid region, so there would not be a significant reward to be claimed if they did indeed push on. Thus, in one great coordinated movement, the Tyranids of Hive Fleet Hydra ceased in their advance. They had already devoured the great bounty of the agri-regions of this world, and it seemed that the hive mind was content to abandon the final remaining pole. It had feasted enough, and it would only be wasting its own bounty by attempting to swat away the Eldari forces, who seemingly only guarded a small frozen wasteland. The Tyranid swarms retreated back to the vast digestion pools, throwing themselves within the acidic depths, sacrificing their own biomass to be reclaimed back by the Hydra. Once they had subsumed the life essence of their own forces, the biofleets left Methuselahs as a barren, empty husk, pocked with the ruins of their devastating approach. All that was left was a single region, isolated in the frigid southern pole, where a lone webway gate still hummed. The surviving Eldari parted ways, slipping into the webway to travel back to their respective homes, having faced the full brunt of the Hydra, and lived to tell of their tale. The Hive fleet named as Hydra is truly an enigma within the Tyranid species. Thus far, they are the only recorded tendril which specifically chooses to cannibalize upon the fallen remains of their kin. And yet, this scavenging habit has allowed them to grow in strength, to the point where they stand as a near-galactic threat. We can only speculate as to their potential size should they feast upon the remains of a major hive fleet, such as Leviathan or Behemoth. But perhaps that is their destiny, and one day they will be the sole surviving hive fleet in existence. There are some xenobiologists, including the famed Ekros van Zendrecht, who theorizes that the emergence of the Hydra shows that the Tyranids have entered into the next phase of their invasion into our galaxy. They believe that it shows an adaptation to death itself, and that from their consumption of the fallen, that the Tyranids will create new, terrifying beasts, perfectly tuned towards combating a foe which has already proven itself to be deadly to their species. Thus, in the not-too-distant future, these theorists will expect to see an evolutionary boom within the bioforms of the Hydra, where the Hive will begin to create a vast range of highly specialized adapted units, each of which has been designed specifically to counter the strengths of the various defenders of the galaxy. We should also consider that this Hive fleet may have never been intended to eclipse the growth of the larger hives. We can almost see it as an equivalent to our own immune system, where our body will undergo a process of autophagy, consuming dysfunctional senescent cells, so as to not waste their precious resources. In the same way, the sole goal of the Hydra may be to simply devour the fallen biomass of the Tyranids, which would then be fed back to the original Hive so as to mitigate some of their losses. This would make some sense, given that the Hydra will typically follow in the same path as other Hive fleets, but thus far we have not seen this theorized donation of biomass, and instead the Hive simply acts on its own desires. In truth, I believe this to be a parasitic hive, and that the hunger for Tyranid flesh is one which cannot be shaken. The Hydra has formed a near-perfect method for growing and feasting, and we can only wonder as to how large they may grow if they are not hunted down and eradicated. If the various sentient species of the galaxy are ultimately successful in curtailing the great Tyranid menace, by destroying the many invasive Hive fleets, then this victory may only be short-lived. I believe that in their deaths, the Hydra will emerge, consuming all that they can from each and every fallen bioship until it has swelled in size to eclipse any Hive fleet previously seen. At this point, it will be adapted to near every defense which the galaxy has to offer, and from its final assault, there will be none who may find escape, and all will be devoured within the bloated belly of the Hydra. My dearest friends, this shall now bring us to our end. I thank you all for listening to this tale in its entirety, and I hope that you will join me again for a future story on the horrors of the 41st millennium. For now, however, I must once again close this chapter. Thank you all for listening, and I wish you a pleasant day. But for now, goodbye.